Before we start, remember one name: Grace. Because by the time this ends, you will understand exactly why almost none of the top 500 companies know that name right now, but soon will. And you will understand how a billion-dollar piece of software that was built in secret, stolen in broad daylight, and was only returned to its creator when a 13-year-old kid decided to help flip the system that tried to erase her. This is not a story about a data breach. This is a story about corporate erasure, about how legacy companies treat human ingenuity as a disposable line item, about how they weaponize contracts, bury threats behind non-disclosure agreements, and use court-issued gag orders like financial shields, and about what happens when the person who built the lock finally decides to pull the key. Grace had built a system that could not be broken from the outside, so the company broke it from within. They erased her name. They rewrote the origin story. They turned a decade of isolated development into a proprietary asset, all while quietly funneling enterprise licensing fees into a corporate account that would never pay her. But they forgot one thing. Creators leave fingerprints. The silence broke on a Tuesday. Not with a subpoena. Not with a whistleblower leak. Not with a journalist's encrypted tip. With a direct message to an account Grace had not checked in months. The username: Marky Mark. The message was blunt and simple. Why isn't your name on it? Grace stared at the screen. The kid, the same 13-year-old, who had pulled apart her firewall architecture on a public developer forum and nearly revived her stalled legal case. He had found her through a back channel. And he was angry. His parents had grounded him for a weekend over a missed curfew. He was dealing with arbitrary authority, the kind that feels like a padded cage when you are 13, and in that frustration, he had drawn a straight line between his parents, control, and the company that seemed to be stealing Grace's software. Both liked to flex power over people dependent on them. Both assumed compliance was the default. He was irritated, and he wanted an answer. And then, casually, he dropped a line that made Grace's hands freeze over the keyboard. You really forgot about the kill switch you embedded, didn't you? That's the only reason you'd let them get away with this. Grace sat back in surprise. The kid was not just smart. He was operating on a frequency most senior engineers never reach. She thought of her own parents, how they had quietly throttled her curiosity as a teen. She had spent her life building exits. This kid had just walked through one. He had found it in the first strings of code. Buried deep, she had thought, wrapped in layers that looked impossibly complex to the untrained eye. He followed up. Super complicated. You used AI to write it. Had to. Nobody hand-codes this architecture from scratch anymore. Grace remembered the series of events that led to the kill switch's creation. 3 months of dead ends. Logic loops that refused to close. Finally, she fed the problem into a semi-public new AI engine. It was a new tech that almost nobody knew about at the time, and they needed people to test what it could do. Being a coder, Grace had gotten a private invite, so she handed the problem over to the new, and still clunky, AI tech to see what it was all about. Stripped of emotion. Armed only with the math and structural constraints of her input, within just a few minutes the AI gave her a framework. It was workable. Simple. Almost embarrassingly straightforward. But it needed a loop to trigger. The AI had asked for a numerical parameter. She had typed her lucky number, 7. The AI changed it to the number 8, as 7, by its calculations, was too predictable. Then the program compiled. It was not elegant. It was not unbreakable. By modern standards, the code was basic enough that a skilled cryptographer could easily dismantle it, if they understood the simplicity of the base programming, that is. But it worked. She added a couple layers to it she thought were clever, and to her surprise, they fit on the first test run. She then loaded it, locked it away, and decided not to waste even another hour on a kill switch. In truth, she had forgotten all about it, but now, she had nothing to lose if she wanted to play that card. Back then, she had needed to focus on the real work. A high-end firewall that stopped 95% of cyber attacks cold, and be able to slow down the top 5% of elite hackers. Hopefully until they could be traced or give up before they could be tracked down. She used looping code and algorithmic rabbit holes that only the system recognized as predetermined. Anyone who went too far down one got automatically blocked. Their ISP, their machine identity, even their behavioral pattern of code breaking could be mapped. She thought it was ingenious. However, Marky Mark figured it all out in just a weekend, and now he was saying maybe that simple kill switch that guarded the system from internal threat like the one she'd fallen victim to might be more effective than she had at first believed. Here's a quick note. If you're enjoying this episode, please take a moment to help our new channel grow by clicking the like and subscribe buttons. It would really help us keep bringing you more stories like this. Now back to the story. Sure, individual companies can be locked out of a program. That is standard license enforcement. But a system-wide shutdown would paralyze the entire business sector that relies on it. Grace's first instinct was tactical. Trigger it. Pull the cord. Force the company's hand. But before she could type anything, another message appeared. You do not need to trigger anything, the kid typed. He must be reading my mind, Grace thought as Mark continued to type. His latest message. Nobody buys a firewall that has a kill switch they do not control. The thousands of companies that already licensed it? They will either demand it removed permanently, or they will demand refunds. Either way, it gives you leverage. She typed, "You're a genius," with a smiley face. He was right. The threat was worth more than the execution. But the gag order still hung over her. How do you wield leverage without speaking? Then she pulled up the judge's order and would again read it word by word. The restriction was precise. Neither party could conduct new interviews about the civil case. It said nothing about interviews regarding how the software actually worked, its limitations, its architectural constraints. Likely because that type of information is routinely discussed publicly by users, sellers, and security auditors. It is essential to marketing. It is essential to compliance. The order had a blind spot. Grace just had to step into it. She just needed to remind the market that the new firewall they were trusting to protect their secrets had a back door. One that the company who sold it to them did not have access to, without specifically saying it. She had to be careful to not cross the guidelines of the legal gag order. She scheduled a technical interview with a leading cybersecurity journal. Is this true? Was what the interviewer asked, wide-eyed with anticipation, as she knew once she sent this story out, it would be national news within a week, if not sooner. Immediately after the interview ended, the tech press ran with it. Within 48 hours, enterprise compliance departments demanded audits. Licensing teams froze new contracts. The company's legal division scrambled to issue reassurances, but you cannot reassure a market that is suddenly staring at the potential of their multi-million and multi-billion-dollar secrets being laid bare for any weekend hacker to gain access to. The panic was not just operational. It was financial. Grace's ex-work company was sitting on a pending acquisition worth $1.3 billion. That's billion with a capital B. The entire deal hinged on conditions. The firewall had to remain fully operational, fully auditable, and completely stable. If the system failed during inspection testing, the buyers walked. The stock would plummet. The boardroom turned into a war zone. Their response was swift, brutal, and deeply personal. They did not just defend, they attacked. They filed an aggressive civil suit directly against Grace, alleging breach of fiduciary duty, corporate espionage, and unauthorized access to proprietary trade secrets. They escalated further. Corporate counsel threatened to refer the matter to federal prosecutors for wire fraud and computer intrusion charges. They wanted her face on an indictment. They wanted her personal assets frozen. They wanted to make an example of her, so no other independent developer ever thought about holding leverage over a top Fortune 500 infrastructure again. But the judge was done playing referee in a rigged game. He reviewed the new filings, cross-referenced them against the original gag order, and drew a hard line in legal law. He ruled that the gag order itself proved the court recognized the highly sensitive, unresolved nature of the intellectual property dispute, allowing a retaliatory civil suit, or a criminal referral while the primary civil case was stayed, would violate fundamental due process. He denied every motion for criminal escalation. He stayed the new civil action indefinitely. Now cornered, the company doubled down on the technical fix. In their rush to isolate the administrative checkpoint and bypass the override, their own lead engineers pushed emergency diagnostic commands directly into the core architecture. And, just like that, the system responded. But not the way they expected. The rabbit holes collapsed. The recursive loops engaged. The firewall did not crash. It paused. A silent, system-wide lockout. Within the next 36 hours, if the security loop wasn't closed, all computer data behind the firewall would be exposed. The firewall itself would simply stop performing, not just at her old company, but on any data system it was embedded in. Until then, it sat there, frozen, waiting for a key that only existed in one place. Grace's mind. They had no choice. They flew Grace into a secure operations center, surrounded by 3 floors of panicked engineers, legal observers, and compliance officers. Grace sat down at the computer terminal, but before even touching a keyboard, she turned to the lead counsel in the room. She laid out her terms. $41 million up front, pulled immediately from the licensing revenue already collected. 38% royalties on every future license sold, paid in perpetuity. Full reinstatement of her name across all patents, public credits, and enterprise documentation. Immediate dissolution of the gag order by mutual motion. The room went cold. The legal counsel called it extortion. The CFO called it financially unrealistic. They argued that corporate governance would never approve such terms. They told her to take a handsome settlement and walk away. They threatened to rebuild the architecture from scratch. They said it would take time, but it could be done. As the lead counsel for the company spoke, Grace just nodded toward the main terminal that had just begun to flash red, with a warning of the pending shutdown of all programming. It was actually something that surprised even her. "Well," she said, glancing to the warning alert, "it looks like you might want to get started." Then Grace's financial lawyer walked in and advised her to let him take it from here. His name was Derek Coleman, a 60-year-old legal juggernaut. Everyone in the corporate world knew him, or knew of him. The lead counsel looked to Mr. Coleman and paled. He pulled out a phone from his jacket, walked away to an area of privacy, and made a call. The call lasted 9 minutes. When he hung up, the posture in the room collapsed. The company caved. They had no choice. There was a $1.3 billion deal at stake, making what Grace was demanding seem like peanuts in the grand scheme of things. They executed the wire transfer within a half hour after the call as Grace sat patiently and waited. 21 of the $41 million hit her escrow account before the ink was dry on the revised contract, with the additional $20 million pending release immediately after the reactivation of the program. The 38% royalty structure was now locked into perpetuity, secured in an ironclad contract, Mr. Coleman assured her. Grace thought this might be the easiest legal fee he would ever earn. Once her lawyer gave her that green light, only then did she turn to the computer terminal. When she started typing the sequence, the room held its breath. She entered the parameter, navigated the encryption layer, fed the correct answer through the 8th iteration as designed. The system verified it. The firewall rebooted. The $1.3 billion deal was back on track. The company techs watched her hands move across the terminal. Even with root access, even with the source documentation open on secondary monitors, they could not follow the architecture. The logic was too layered. The obfuscation was too deeply recursive. They realized in that moment that Grace was not just the original author. She was the only living compiler for this system. Without her, a rebuild to the system would take years to reverse engineer manually. Weeks, maybe months to recreate, even with the latest AI. With her, it took minutes to reboot the current system, if any new complications arose, in the immediate future. She was officially indispensable. Then, once the system stabilized running perfectly, she stood and walked to a new computer terminal in the room. This was also part of the agreement the company made with her. On the screen, she moved to a folder labeled Internal IZO. She opened it. It contained internal security logs. She moved to the time-stamped executive surveillance footage from the original meeting, just over a year ago. The footage showed the exact original negotiation as it had unfolded. It showed the CEO sitting across from Grace. It captured his voice, clear as day, agreeing to her terms. It showed him signing the intellectual property retention clause with a smile. It showed him explicitly stating that the code would remain hers and that any corporate integration would require a separate, ongoing licensing agreement. The affidavit from Jane, the work-for-hire argument, the entire narrative of corporate ownership, was all built on a provable and recorded lie. Within 24 hours, the CEO was publicly terminated for cause. no severance. Nothing more than a box of belongings in his hands, as he was escorted out by security, the same as the other terminations he had orchestrated over the years. The next day, the board issued a press release, citing gross misconduct, fraudulent representation of corporate assets, and violation of fiduciary duty. Within 24 hours, federal regulators opened an independent inquiry into the company's licensing practices and internal audit failures. The man who tried to erase her was now facing potential criminal charges for wire fraud and perjury. Grace's name was reinstated on every technical document, every patent filing, every enterprise-facing architecture dashboard. The judge dissolved the gag order by mutual motion that same afternoon. The case never went to trial. It did not need to. Grace left that building a rich woman. But she did not celebrate with champagne. She did not call the press. The first thing she did was go home and opened her laptop, found the encrypted thread, and typed a single message to Marky Mark. Mark, I owe you so much. What do you want as a thank you? Name anything you desire. His reply came 3 seconds later. The new XJ game console. The limited edition. My parents will not buy it. They say it is too expensive. Grace smiled and began wiring the money before she finished reading the sentence. She added a note. Keep breaking things. Just break them for the right reasons. She made a personal note to start a trust fund under the name Marky Mark, so that her 13-year-old savior, but now he was 14 years old, she learned, would never have to struggle to pay college tuition or buy the latest new gaming console. She would keep the trust secure until he turned 18. Then another trust would release each year over the next few years to ensure his education was fully funded while also protecting it from outside threats. Then she thought for a moment. Marky Mark might be richer than her by the time he turned 20-something. She laughed because it was totally possible, she believed. She thought about her own situation. And laughed again, but for this time, for a lifetime of relief. They tried to erase her. They bet on silence. They bet on time. They bet that a woman who worked alone, on her own hours, with her own logic, would eventually fold under the weight of a system built to outlast her. But the system had a flaw. It forgot that creators leave fingerprints, and it forgot that sometimes a 13-year-old kid with a weekend, a grudge, and a mind that refuses to accept arbitrary control will find the switch they did not know existed. The firewall still works. Cyber attacks still break against it. But now, when you pull up the licensing documentation, when you read the technical credits, when you see the architecture that protects billions of dollars in infrastructure, you will see it. Grace. Not erased. Not forgotten. Just paid. And if you are watching this, remember. Corporate crime is not always about stolen money. Sometimes it is about stolen names. About credit taken, contracts twisted, and silence enforced. But code does not lie. And neither does leverage. Stay sharp. Question the fine print. And never assume the person who built the lock is gone. If you enjoyed this episode and want to be sure you get notified when the next episode is released, then join our Inner Circle email notification group. Even if the YouTube algorithm fails to notify you, we won't. The link along with additional benefits are in the description. Thanks for watching.